I think of the history of fiction frequently, sometimes in dizzying spirals, sometimes in flashes of sparked awe. When thinking of the history of stories, people often think of the ones that were written, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Odyssey, or the Tale of Genji. But I think far more often of the stories that were birthed when humans were scattered tribes of wanderers. Oral narratives that were not just fiction, but vessels for communal and cultural knowledge. The stories humans compose reflect our values and shape cultural memory, but beyond that, they serve as a mouthpiece for what people want for their futures. The Odyssey chronicles the decade-spanning struggle of Odysseus to return home, and every character endures trials, physical and psychological, that would drive any real person mad. Yet they prevail against gods, monsters, and men, because Homer meant for them to emerge triumphant. He meant to spread a story that said war, loss, pain, all of these things have their endings. Though the queer literature I covered for this project was written some 2,000 years later, the author's goals align with the generations of the storytellers that came before them. The question of what it means to be human. What should we strive for in life? What limits us? Especially because in many countries and spaces, queer people are still considered to be subhuman or not human at all. Authors of queer fantasy are carving a space that inquires into how queer people fit into this human history of narrative, but in doing so they also disregard previous boundaries established to be the walls of the human category. Many of the characters in the books I read were not human. Some were ghosts, others orcs or the descendants of gods. But despite this distinction of identity, these character arcs are framed within ultimately human struggles. Thus, the category of human is widened by making these characters queer within fantasy worlds. The strategies authors use to accomplish the breaking of the human boundaries are varied. Some, such as Tasha Suri with the Jasmine Throne, create an entire new class of supernatural beings, with powers more suited to the realms of God than the earth of man. Moreover, she gives these powers to her queer main character, Priya, and as Priya's power grows, Suri leads the reader to ask, is Priya still human? She kills, she burns, she tears herself apart in the name of rebellion and her love for a perfectly human princess. Priya is a disruption of the reader's assumptions about queer woman-woman relationships and the reader's assumptions about gender, race, and sexuality as a whole that have been constructed by the expectations of a heteronormative, capitalist, and patriarchal society. Her relationship with another woman is not a peaceful fling, but a love that tears at both parties with teeth and claws born from their opposing ambitions. Because Priya and Malini refuse to limit each other, they instead become destined to destroy one another. With race and gender, class and ethnic difference becomes a living, breathing monster that threatens to devour Priya and Malini even in this fictional world. Suri lines her fantasy world with the harsh barbs of our reality to inflict a sorrowing truth, that the interlocking oppressions of race, gender, and class are ancient and salient, but they are the projections of an unequal society rather than the innate consciousness of humanity. Because though Priya spills blood, it is the blood of an empire that ordered the genocide of her people, and though Malini burns the city, it was her brother, a king who wielded authority through blood, that burned her first. The space that authors construct when writing queer fantasy is informed by hierarchies, both within the genre and queer reality. Queer theory is inherently conscious of and critical of varying cultural hierarchies, particularly sexual, gender, and race hierarchies. These hierarchies are structures that queer people must constantly brace themselves against. However, through queer fantasy, authors can create a liminal space in which they can choose what hierarchies to employ, if any at all. In Legends and Lattes, for example, there is no sexual or gender discrimination. This decision, to me, is significant. Hardship is not an experience anyone can escape in the span of their lives, but if those hardships are the consequence of an innate feature of one's identity, such as sexual orientation, gender, or race, they bear an infinitely greater weight. If parts of your identity make you a target, life itself becomes a game of survival. Instead of being proud of who you love, how you present yourself, and your heritage, you must hide your feelings, mask your presentation, and employ varying levels of double consciousness to protect yourself, as seen with Viv, who must make herself smaller in order not to be perceived as a threat by the rest of society. Baldry, the author's, decision to remove some of these threats entirely thus becomes a form of liberation. Liberation to experience the struggles of the majority without the additional weight threatening to sink you as a member of the minority, and open up avenues for more capacious options for becoming and belonging. While not all authors employ this liberation strategy, they empower their queer characters by giving them preternatural abilities. Many of the queer fantasy books I reviewed had world building that made queer relationships unacceptable, whether it be through the toxic patriarchy in the Jasmine Throne or the Purian Victorian era of A Restless Truth. The queer characters find themselves threatened and constrained by their sexual orientations, even as they find love. But the authors do not leave them stranded. You see, fantasy is unique because the characters can be gifted abilities that are impossible within our reality. Thus, the same oppressions that pressure queer people in this reality do not pose the same threat within fantasy. These queer characters, with their ability to summon ghosts or control nature or people, become something else, something more than human that cannot be contained by the human oppressions and categories we construct. Lastly, though it may be obvious, the power of queer fantasy lies in representation. Visibility is the first step in many liberation movements. The majority removing themselves from the private sphere to the public majority space is a radical and disruptive act. Stories shape culture and public consciousness. This is proven. So in this era of LGBTQ movements for human rights, as we battle for acceptance and dignity, not just legally, but culturally, it is vital that queer people see themselves in the stories that shape culture, and that the majority sees queer people as belonging in those stories. I'm talking about positive representation, not the molesters in Game of Thrones, but stories where queer people are their own agents. They might be heroes, like Achilles, or they might be avengers, like Priya, or they might just be kids looking for acceptance from their families, like Yadriel. These characters enter formerly heteronormative spaces of narrative, as seen with the Iliad and the Song of Achilles, in the Bible and Angels Before Man, and by their very nature redefine the bounds of grand fantastical storytelling. It says, quite simply, we can do everything you can do. Change history, start wars, bring down empires, but we can also choose peace, stop the wars from starting, and love our partners to the end of it all, just as you do. Going forward, as in my home country we threaten to regress and rebind people with the chains they broke, I believe, with the deepest of convictions, that queer stories, especially the grandest and most impossible ones, are vital to our survival and belonging. We know what it means to be human. Thank you.